current richest people in the world, like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates, all have fortunes worth well over $100 billion. And yet, if we account for inflation, their wealth is not even close to making them the richest people ever. So today, we're delving into the past to explore the richest people in history and how they made their unthinkably large fortunes. And we start with number 1, John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate that's widely considered the richest self-made man in modern history, with an approximate net worth of around $400 billion in today's money, even after giving a substantial amount of his fortune away. And yet, he started from very humble beginnings. John D. Rockefeller was born into a large family with a father who was frequently absent and was regarded as a con man who sold worthless potions. So from a young age, John needed to help provide for the family and took on odd jobs like looking after the neighbors' turkeys or selling potatoes and candy. Even though these things didn't pay a lot, John was really good at them and worked really hard, so he was able to save enough money to start offering small loans to other people. So even as a young boy, that entrepreneurial instinct was there. But when he turned 16, he dropped out of school and got his first real job as a bookkeeper, earning just 50 cents a day. However, after working there for around 2 years, his employers still refused to give him a meaningful raise, and so he decided to start his own produce business, as he had a goal to make $100,000, and he knew he'd need to build something of his own to reach that target. Luckily, this first job had already taught him a lot and gave him the experience, connections, and reputation to raise $4,000 for starting his own venture, a business selling goods like meat, hay, and grain, which did well. In the first year of trading, it made almost $500,000. Of course, Rockefeller didn't keep all of that himself. A lot of it went back into business expenses and loans, but it meant when a big opportunity arose, Rockefeller now had some real money to invest. And that opportunity was oil. In 1859, the first American oil well was discovered, which began the Pennsylvania oil rush. However, Rockefeller realized that whilst most people were trying to get rich from drilling oil, the bigger profits were actually in oil refinery. So, at just 24 years old, he used the money from his first business to build an oil refinery. Now, around this time, he met a man named Henry Flagler, who was interested in investing in his business. And so, together, they incorporated the Standard Oil Company and began the process of buying out all the smaller, nearby oil refineries that they were in competition with. Whenever any of these refineries refused to sell their business to him, he simply started selling his oil at a loss, so that all their customers flocked to him instead, which would put these smaller companies out of business. These kind of practices allowed the Standard Oil Company to keep expanding across the entire country. They kept buying out rivals, undercutting competitors, and cutting costs wherever possible. The more they grew, the more negotiating power they had, so they could push for better rates and prices and discounts on everything. Rockefeller was also known for some secret shady deals, and so with all of these factors combined, by the 1870s, Rockefeller's oil company owned 90% of the world's oil refining industry. He also hired the owners of the oil refineries he bought as board trustees, which meant that all the smartest oil experts were all working within one super company, with Rockefeller at the head of it. He owned 20,000 oil wells, had over 100,000 employees, and at the very peak, some estimate its total value would today have been worth almost $1 trillion. This kind of empire was pretty unheard of, but Rockefeller wasn't done yet. At this point in time, the two biggest industries were oil and railroads. So Rockefeller set out to do a similar thing he'd just done with oil, with railroads. However, as he began monopolizing another industry, he also began to become a bit of a public enemy, He was depicted as the ultimate symbol of corporate greed and cruelty. In response to Rockefeller's ever-growing empire, legislation was passed to try and prevent these kind of monopolies. In particular, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, which would lead to the breakup of Standard Oil into different subsidiaries. Except, over time, many of these subsidiaries would simply merge back together and are still around to this day, such as BP and Chevron. And since Rockefeller kept his share in all those companies even after they split up, it meant that at the time of his death, he was still the richest person in the world, and likely the richest self-made man in all of modern history. Now, what should we actually think about John D. Rockefeller? On the one hand, he made oil an affordable commodity and brought it to the masses. He went from nothing to building a business empire that may never be matched again. He gave around $540 million to charitable causes, which, when you adjust for inflation, makes him one of the most accomplished philanthropists ever. However, on the other hand, Rockefeller was a greedy, ruthless tyrant of business who often bullied, extorted, and exploited others on his merciless path to dominance, especially the tactics used to crush the competition. Biographer Ron Chernow argues his good side was every bit as good as his bad side was bad. Seldom has history produced such a contradictory figure. But what's undeniable is he will always be remembered for his insanely vast fortune and the impact he had. But wait, we now need to travel back in time even further, to someone who was arguably much richer than Rockefeller, and yet many people have never heard of him. However, quick side note before that, the further back in history we go, the harder it is to definitively rank wealth. When we're talking about modern history, it's a lot easier. For example, we can say with a good level of certainty that Andrew Carnegie had an empire worth around $310 billion, as he founded the Carnegie Steel Company, which later became US Steel, the first billion-dollar company in the world. We also know that Henry Ford had an empire worth around $200 billion when he died in 1947, because he founded Ford Motor Company and pioneered assembly line mass production. And so with businessmen like that, it's much easier to calculate their wealth. But once we start talking about the value of owning countries and land, things get a little blurrier. Even in present day, some people would disagree with the Forbes rich list that puts Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos as the richest people in the world. It's been argued that someone like Vladimir Putin may be the real wealthiest person alive today. It's just difficult to verify exactly what he owns. So, bearing all of that in mind, let's go back to our list of the richest people in history and venture all the way back to the 14th century, where we find Mansa Musa, considered by many historians as the richest human to ever live. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire in Africa for 25 years, which was extremely rich in salt and gold. In fact, some sources estimate they were the largest gold producer in the world and had more than half of the world's total supply. And so Mansa spent the early part of his reign expanding Mali's trade routes, which allowed them to trade their gold and salt all across Africa and Asia. Under his leadership, the Mali Empire tripled in size. He conquered 24 major cities, and it's believed he never lost a battle in his lifetime. However, Mansa also got many territories to join the Mali Empire willingly, due to the relatively high quality of life that its citizens had. However, Mansa wasn't content with that. He wanted to truly put the Mali Empire on the map to the whole world. Now, since he was a devoutly religious Muslim, he'd already planned to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and then he realized he could use this trip as an opportunity to capture the world's attention. And thus, in 1324, he began the most extravagant pilgrimage in human history. The voyage, which would span an estimated 4,000 miles, was travelled by Mansa Musa with tens of thousands of soldiers, slaves and heralds, draped in Persian silk and carrying golden staffs. One account estimated up to 60,000 people travelled with him, each carrying up to hundreds of pounds in gold. It's fair to say it was a spectacle that got noticed. But Mansa also gave away huge amounts of gold to the poor that he met along his route, and it was also reported he built a mosque every Friday. Having said that, his generosity somewhat backfired, because it's also claimed that he spent so much gold on souvenirs during his journey that he destabilized the local economy and caused mass inflation, since these territories had never had so much gold before and he was handing it out so freely. And if you really think about that, it highlights how absurdly rich Mansa Musa was, that he essentially caused a financial crisis by spending too much on his travels. When he did finally return from his pilgrimage though, the Mali Empire had annexed Timbuktu under his orders, and he established that as the epicenter for commerce in the region. He'd also brought back with him scholars and architects, who helped him build schools and mosques. Mansa even established the first major university in the region, which could take up to 25,000 students and had one of the largest libraries in the world. All of these different building projects further elevated the city's reputation and helped attract even more top scholars from all over Africa and beyond. And therefore, many historians credit Mansa with leading the Mali Empire to even greater prosperity and development. However, whilst Mansa did indeed put the Mali Empire on the map like he wanted, it didn't quite have the intended consequences. As news of their huge wealth and gold supplies made its way to Europe, several European powers saw an opportunity to conquer the empire and take the resources for themselves. But by that point, Mansa would have died and already cemented himself in history as one of the richest people to ever live. Now, as for how rich he was, some estimates put Mansa's modern day wealth equivalent at between $400 and $500 billion. But remember, it's extremely difficult to accurately compare today's money with a fortune that was built on salt, gold, and territory. So, I guess you could say, take this estimate with a very big pinch of salt. However, because historians can't quite agree on how to compare wealth from so many centuries ago, that means the title of the richest person ever is still up for debate. So, let's finish this video with 3 very honourable mentions who may be contenders. One person that could have been the richest in history is technically Genghis Khan. The fearsome Mongol leader conquered a mind-blowing 12 million square miles of land between 1206 and his death in 1227, more than anyone else in history. As he conquered all of these different kingdoms, he also took their wealth and possessions, which, combined with the value of the land that he took, would arguably have been worth trillions of dollars. Or, in other words, incomprehensibly large amounts that's difficult to even quantify. It's an extremely brutal way to build your fortune, but it was certainly effective. Another candidate for the richest person in history is Jakob Fugger, also known as Jakob Fugger the Rich. And you don't get a name like that without having a pretty giant fortune. In fact, if you took Europe's entire economic output at the time Jakob was alive, he owned 2.2% of all of that, of the entire continent. Now, Jakob was the 10th of 11 children, but would go on to become a banker who financed kings, explorers, and religious leaders. What's crucial here though, is that before Fugger came along, Christians could not legally charge interest on loans, but he managed to convince the Pope to change this and then profited from that rule change immensely. In a biography written about him, the author explains that Fugger just seemed to have a gift for making money and spotting opportunities, especially when it came to business and investments. For example, when the Archduke of Austria desperately needed a loan, Fugger decided to offer it when no other banker would, and it paid off big time. He also had a great talent for convincing other people to lend him money so that he could invest it and turn it into a much bigger profit. He was undeniably very strategic and shrewd, and built a fortune that would today be worth an estimated $400 billion. But now it's time for one final candidate for the richest person ever, and that is Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, reigning from 27 BC until his death in 14 AD. Time magazine once estimated his equivalent net worth today as being $4.6 trillion, because he personally owned all of Egypt. But again, going back this far in time, it's virtually impossible to put an accurate number on his wealth. So we can't say for certain who takes the title of the richest person ever, but we can definitively say that all of these names mentioned in this video had obscene levels of wealth and were amongst the wealthiest humans to ever live, with fortunes far bigger than Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. At least for now. Of course, both of these men are still working and growing their business empires, so if either of them have some more major breakthroughs, like colonizing Mars, then who knows how vast their fortunes may become.